Participants are joining. Very warm welcome to this latest of our Kohima Educational Trust webinars. A little bit of a nightmare there. My computer crashed and I've just managed to get back on, but it's a real pleasure tonight to welcome Colonel Mike Tickner back with us. He's been with us before and we're really looking forward to quite an extraordinary story. So I can see people joining from all over the world again. One of the great joys of these KET webinars is the fact that we have people from the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, India, and so on. So very warm welcome from me to Rob Lyman as we all join. And do make sure that you put any questions in the chat or the Q&A session, and we'll make sure that we respond to them appropriately tonight. And I think that's about time for me to hand over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Rob. And yeah, that was a last-minute panic. Rob disappeared, and the wonders of the internet. Anyway, we're all here, and so are you, which is fabulous. And thank you so much for joining us, and welcome back to our KET webinar series, and the first one in a couple of months. Since we were last together, some of you joined us in York, where we had a very special evening of remembrance, followed the next day by the commemoration service. Pictures are on our website, and we will soon have the recording of the evening also available there. But tonight, as part of the build-up to VJ80, we are very pleased to bring you this webinar entitled The Savage Wars of Peace. 80 years ago, the war in the Far East ended abruptly following the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But while the Japanese army had been defeated in Burma and was losing the war in the Pacific, her army in many other countries, Malaya, Hong Kong, to name but a few, remained undefeated. Many of these countries saw the end of the war as their chance for independence, and Gurkha, Indian and British troops became responsible for restoring colonial rule and became locked into open combat. Meanwhile, the Allies' most pressing task was recovering their prisoners of war and civilian internees, knowing little about their condition or locations. But what was to become clear was that Japan's sudden surrender created a seismic resetting of the political and social order in the Far East, as power vacuums were exploited for political gain and rapid decisions were made, with consequences which still reverberate today. And here to take us through the events of this time in detail, as Rob has said, Colonel Mike Tickner, a retired regular army officer with a long-term interest in the British Army in India, and particularly the Far East campaigns and the immediate aftermath. He regularly gives talks and has given a webinar for KET in the past, and he gives talks to military and civilian groups, clubs and museums, and writes the occasional article. He's led battlefield studies to India and Southeast Asia, and most recently to Singapore. As well as spending many rainy nights in both the North German Plain and Salisbury Plain, he has also served in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, which is some record. And as always, the wonderful Rob Lyman is with us this evening, who will set the scene and bring his much admired perspective to it all. Over to you, Rob.
Well, thank you again, Sylvia. And look, thank you very much, everyone who's joined tonight for this webinar. Thank you all those who will be listening to this subsequently online. I've had a number of emails from people today looking forward to hearing Mike tonight. And it's quite opportune, isn't it? Because only a few months ago, Phil Craig, a good friend of the KET, published his new book on 1945, in which he raised the subject of Mike's talk tonight. And it's caused quite a lot of consternation in those areas of the world that aren't aware of what the aftermath of victory in 1945, as Sylvia said, and Mike will explain, victory came much more quickly than anyone expected. And as partly as a result of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And all of a sudden, a whole new range of challenges faced particularly the Indian Army. And we had some very, very bizarre situations that I'm going to enjoy listening to Mike explaining. Well, I'm not sure anyone could ever have conceived of the situation that the 17th and the 20th Divisions in particular found themselves up against in 1945 and 1946. But I'm going to let Mike develop the story in more detail and explain some of the mystery behind the events that followed the immediate end of the Second World War. So, Mike, very warm welcome again to the Kohima Educational Trust, and we're really looking forward to the talk.
Rob Sylvia, thank you for your kind words. Today is Monday, the 6th of August, 1945. In 2 days' time, on Wednesday, it'll mark the 3-month point of the war in Europe having concluded. However, much has happened. In 7 months' time, Churchill will make his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. However, the Iron Curtain has firmly dropped over Eastern Europe, and the people are feeling the steel-shod boot of Russian oppression. Britain has had a general election, the first general election in 10 years, and Clement Attlee, who was Churchill's wartime deputy, is now the Prime Minister. This is the first election that is ever called during a war, and is called much earlier than anybody expected. Attlee certainly catches out the Conservatives, and he catches out many of his own party. It's worth noting that the last election was in November 1935, so anybody under 31 has never voted before. Also, people under 21 cannot vote, which will include a large cohort of servicemen and women who would have seen a lot of action and cannot vote. The service vote itself is very badly organised. In fact, only 12% of servicemen actually manage to cast their vote. It's commonly said that it's the service vote that gets rid of Churchill. The reality is different. However, there are some very, very disgruntled servicemen out there, and we'll meet them in a little bit later. Britain itself, its cities have been destroyed, and the country has been beggared, and we're reliant on war loans from America. It will not be until 1996 that we finish repaying America for the Second World War. Europe is in a much worse condition than Britain is, with cities and infrastructure destroyed, and tens of thousands of people on the move trying to find their old home, their new home, or to be reunited with their families. Palestine is a British protectorate, and the garrison has been increased up to 2 divisions. Pre-war Jewish migration has been capped. However, now Holocaust survivors are attempting to cross the Mediterranean on anything that floats, and hence the increase in the garrison to use a term for today, stop the boats. As you can see from the photographs on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the boats that arrive, and you see what a terrible condition they're in. And also you'll see with airborne troops, they're fumigating people, the terrible condition of the arrivees. The arrivees are determined to establish the state of Palestine and fight back against the British protectorate, and establish 2 terrorist groups, Ergen and Stern, and between them they write the playbook of modern terrorism that is used by many groups throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The picture you'll see on the right-hand side is King David's Hotel which was used as a headquarters by the British. On the 22nd of July 1946, you'll see the size of the bomb that was detonated, and you may wish to draw similarities between the Brighton bomb in 1984. But what else is happening? Greece is having a civil war, and the 4th Indian Division and an British Airborne Division find themselves in the middle between Greek communists and Greek royalists. But what else is happening? Well, following the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Russia declares war on Japan, and currently 1.5 million Russian troops, I'll say that figure again, 1.5 million Russian troops are heading across Europe to Manchuria. And on the 9th of August, in 3 days' time, the Russians will start the invasion of Manchuria against the Japanese. But the war in the Far East, well, Mandalay and Rangoon have been liberated, and now the Japanese army is in full retreat across the central belt of Burma, heading into Siam and down to Malaya. It's worth noting that the Japanese troops in Siam and Malaya really haven't seen any fighting since 1942. So although the Japanese troops in Burma are in a very poor state, the prospect of future battles appears less rosy. Currently, the Southeast Asia Command are planning Operation Zipper. This is the invasion of Malaya, and it's set for September 1945 and will join Operation Zipper in a little bit. The war in the Pacific continues, and the Americans continue their bloody island hopping, getting closer and closer to Japan. And in June, a few months ago, Okinawa is finally captured, the first island in the Japanese island chain. Daily, American bombers are sending raids into Japan, and over 2 nights or 2 days in Tokyo, over 100,000 of the residents perish, and the US Navy are busy laying mines and sinking Japanese ships in the attempt to starve the Japanese. The invasion of Kyushu, which is one of the western islands which make up Japan, has been planned for November 1945. And Operation Olympus, which is the invasion of mainland Japan, is being planned, and that will occur in March 1946. This morning at 3 o'clock, 6 aircraft and the 3rd 93rd Bombardment Squadron took off from Tinian Air Base. Only one of the aircraft carries any ordnance, and it's piloted by Lt Col Tibbets. Such is the custom of the day. The aircraft bears a girl's name, but it's not a sweetheart, it's not a Hollywood pin-up, it's not a wife, it's his mother, Mrs. Enola Gay Tibbets from Adams County, Illinois. It's a 6-hour flight to the target, and the primary target has received very little bombing previously. Consequently, because of the height that the aircraft are flying, the air raid siren isn't sounded. The aiming point is where 2 rivers meet in the centre of Hiroshima, and at 15 minutes past 8, the ordnance is dropped. Because of the height that it's dropped and strong crosswinds, the little boy drifts 800 yards off target, and 141 pounds of uranium airbursts over Shima District Hospital. On the 9th of August, another bomb will be dropped on Nagasaki, and through back channels, the Japanese made very, very clear to the Japanese that the 3rd target will be Tokyo. The events of that morning send shockwaves across the world, and many of them still reverberate today. And what I would like to do during this talk is to talk about the confusion and the bloody events that resulted of the sudden surrender of the Japanese. Mountbatten knew of the Manhattan Project. However, he was briefed not to inform his staff. However, he did inform them to start producing plans for a rapid surrender of the Japanese. When the Japanese do surrender, it comes as a shock, and many do not believe it. There's plans for a coup. There's also plans for the Japanese army to head back to Sumatra to fight a last-ditch campaign. But as a result of this inability to even comprehend the idea of surrendering, Prince Haruhito Kanin is sent to Singapore to address the Japanese army, and they're all pulled together. All the officers that are available are pulled together to the ballroom in Raffles Hotel, where he gives them the order that they must surrender, that it is a fact. As a result, some Japanese officers immediately commit suicide in the grounds of Raffles Hotel, and it's estimated 300 Japanese officers will commit suicide in Singapore over the next couple of weeks. MacArthur wants a formal surrender, and this occurs on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September. This is 6 weeks after the Japanese surrender. However, we end up with a series of locally negotiated surrenders to deal with the 5 million Japanese prisoners of war. The whole matter is complicated by a complete breakdown of command and control across the Japanese army. The two pictures you'll see here, of one is of a local surrender, and the picture on the right-hand side is a local surrender document. It's produced by the 1st 10th Gurkha Rifles in Pong in southern Burma. But look at the date. It's the 29th of October, 2.5 months after the Japanese surrender. They're still negotiating local surrender agreements. The Japanese themselves are designated as Japanese surrendered personnel rather than prisoners of war. And this is, I love this photograph. This is Singapore, and you'll notice the Japanese officer there in his service dress, and you'll notice staff officers from the 5th Indian Division gathered around. But what I particularly like is, if people can see the cursor, is the soldier in the background, and you can imagine that the orders he's been given. Any nonsense, shoot now, ask later. Do you understand? Yes, Sarge, I understand. The initial task is to draw Japanese troops into central holding areas where they can be searched, recorded, and filtered for initial to identify war criminals. They also need to be disarmed. This is all organised by the Japanese headquarters and is done with great efficiency. Japanese troops are then put to work, and you'll see Japanese troops here in the centre of Singapore, and also other tasks. So, for example, the docks in Singapore, there's been vast amounts of ammunition that's been sat on the quayside since February 1942, and now after several monsoons and being cooked in the sun, it's in a really unstable condition. Japanese troops are used to load it onto ships and to dump it at sea. Similarly, Japanese troops in Singapore are used to lift mines around the beach, which have had the benefit of 3 years of seawater. Again, other tasks, exhuming bodies, bearing in mind the 40 to 50,000 Chinese that were murdered by the Japanese in the first few months of occupation. And then they're moved to the ports. And again, this is a great photograph. And if you just look at the faces of the soldiers marching past, complete and utter dejection, the faces and the body language. And then the plan is to move them back to Japan as quickly as possible. And the Japanese government are given the task of moving their troops and to pay for it at their own expense. However, the American Navy has been so effective at sinking anything the Japanese own that float. The Japanese estimate that using their surviving shipping, it will take them 7 years to move their troops back to Japan. So therefore, the Allies are approached for assistance. So while this is being planned, measles breaks out, and it absolutely rips through the Japanese in Singapore. And of course, it's quite topical now with the subject of measles. And here you see the 5th Indian Division now have to organise a vaccination and quarantine on top of everything else they have to organise. But what are the main priorities for the Allies in Southeast Asia? And the answer is Operation Mastiff. And if you read the operational directives and operational orders at that time, Operation Mastiff. This is finding and recovering Allied prisoners of war and internees into central locations where they can start being looked after. Why is this a problem? There was only one Red Cross representative in the Far East, and he was in Siam, and he is shot by the Japanese Imperial Navy for being a spy in 1943. Consequently, the Allies have absolutely no idea where prisoners of war and internees are held. In some cases, it is simple. And here we see the jail in Rangoon. Typical colonial jail looks somewhat similar to Strangeways. And you can see that the prisoners of war have written extract digit, Japs gone. But the reality is we don't know where the prisoners of war are. For example, if you read in Slim's Defeat to Victory, you'll read an account of a prisoner of war camp being bombed by accident because they believe that there are Japanese troops in there. The task of finding them is given to an organisation called the Repatriation of Allied Prisoners of War and Internees, or RAPWE. RAPWE work with organisations like Force 136 and the Burmese National Army, and they're dropped into the jungle to try and find these camps. Because the local security situation is so unstable, prisoners of war and internees are ordered to remain within their camps, and the Japanese are ordered to continue to guard them to protect them from the risk of the local population. And to that end, medicine and fuel is airdropped, not fuel, and food is airdropped into the camps. And I've touched on it already, but the breakdown of the local security situation. So let's start by talking about Burma. And here you see the victory parade in Rangoon in the rain. But across Burma, and in fact across all the countries that the Japanese occupy, at best, the Japanese rob the country blind. At worst, they just neglect it. And because nature abhors a vacuum, this vacuum is filled by nationalist groups, ethnic groups, communists. There is a lot of turf wars and carving up territory and settling old scores. Therefore, the 14th Army, as it progresses through Burma, finds itself being sucked more and more into dealing with the local security situation and, quite ironically, protecting any Japanese stragglers they pick up from the local population. And with Burma, the British have a problem of who do they need to work with for the independence movement, for the eventual independence of Burma. Many of the pre-war Burmese population or politicians have been so closely aligned with the Japanese during the occupation, they are simply too toxic to deal with. However, one character does stand out. He's called Aung San. He's 32, he's charismatic, and he has a huge popular following. Known as the Bogyok, or General, he's responsible for recruiting the Burmese National Army, members of the independence movement that fight with the Japanese in the belief that this will lead to the independence of Burma. And the British view increasingly that Aung San is somebody that they can work with. And you see the picture here. Here is Aung San in the centre in his greatcoat. You'll see Clement Attlee here meeting him, and by the look of it, this looks like the garden of 10 Downing Street. The date for Burmese independence is set for January 1948. However, on the 9th of July 1947, a group of armed Burmans from an opposing group assassinate Aung San. He dies that day of his wounds, and he leaves behind a 2-year-old daughter, Suu Kyi. Let's talk a little bit about Malaya, and I touched on it earlier with Operation Zipper. And this is set for the middle of September 1945, and this is going to be an amphibious operation, a D-Day style invasion of Malaya. However, the rapid capitulation of the Japanese suddenly make the plan for Op Zipper irrelevant, so therefore it needs to be quickly recast. And many troops will arrive, and we see the 5th Indian Division here arriving in Singapore on boats and unloaded in the quayside. However, the 5th Indian Division don't arrive until the 4th of September. This is 3 weeks after the surrender. And here we have a great picture of a lorry load of Sikh troops leaving the docks and the crowds watching them. And again, the body language is worth watching. As ever, children will wave at anything. But just look how quiet the adults are in the crowd as they watch yet another army arriving in Singapore. It's not until the 12th of September that Mountbatten will finally receive the Japanese surrender. And this is done in Singapore's municipal buildings. A Union Jack flag that has been hidden in Changi will be hoisted above the building, and a 17-gun salute will be fired after the Japanese surrender. And then a parade is held on the Padang. Attending the parade is somebody called Chin Peng, and you'll see him is there shaking hands with Mountbatten. Chin Peng commands the predominantly Chinese communist resistance movement during the occupation. He has been armed and trained by the British. With the conclusion of the war, the Chinese communists hide their weapons, maintain their network of dead letterboxes, set up old comrades associations, and infiltrate the trade unions. And now, during the following months, the amount of violence, political assassinations, burning down of factories, rioting, general strikes increases and increases and increases. On the 16th of January 1948, assassination squads from the Chinese communists will go out and start killing managers of plantations. Such is the scale of the violence in Malaya and in Singapore. The Malayan police, who are, to be honest, in a pretty parlous state, really don't immediately spot there is a step change in the level of violence and a new phase in the campaign has begun. With these assassinations, the plantations are shot with British weapons, using British ammunition and personnel trained by the British. This is the start of the Malayan emergency. But let's start casting our eye a little further afield. And the problems of re-establishing colonial rule and overseeing the Japanese surrender extends far beyond the British Empire. Both France and Holland have overseas territories, and in the immediately post-war period have insufficient troops to send to, in this case, French Indo-China and the Netherlands East Army, in the Netherlands East Indies. The burden now falls on the already overstretched Indian Army. And let's start by talking about French Indo-China and Operation Masterdom. Japan is able to occupy French Indo-China in 1940 with agreement of the Vichy government, and they are just able to walk in. The French colonial government remain in place until March 1945 and work with the Japanese until they're finally arrested. The pre-war independence movement now turns its attention to opposing the Japanese. And you'll see in this photograph, you have Ho Chi Minh here, and you have Zap, who becomes Ho Chi Minh's main general. And he is trained by the American Office for Strategic, for OSS, who are the precursors of the CIA. And here you see a group photograph. And Ho Chi Minh believes that America is a great inspiration. And at the end of the war, he declares independence and he releases his own Declaration of Independence. And I'll just read you the opening lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights. And you'll probably recognise that damn revolutionary propaganda. China occupies down to the 16th parallel, and Southeast Asia Command need to send troops to occupy the remaining parts of French Indo-China. And 20th Indian Division are sent from Rangoon by air and sea, and they arrive in the first week of September. And here you'll see Captain Scott Bell meeting Admiral Kodo in Saigon. The 20th Indian Division are given over 20 tasks, and each task in its own right, most people would agree it's a divisional task. For example, the release of French prisoner of war and internees, overseeing the re-establishment of French government, overseeing the Japanese surrender. And an uneasy relationship exists in the early weeks between the Viet Minh. However, the relationship breaks down very, very quickly. As the French colons are released, they go on a drinking binge, attack the locals, murder, rape, vandalism, and any relationship with the Vietnamese just gets worse and worse and worse. This is responded to by general strikes and rioting, and the violence escalates. In 6 weeks' time, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey of OSS will get caught up in an ambush and killed. He will be the first American serviceman to be killed in Vietnam. The 20th Indian Division is really overmatched the number of tasks that it has, and as violence escalates, it takes the controversial decision to rearm the Japanese and to use them. And here we see a picture here of the 4th 10th Gurkha Rifles briefing for a joint operation of Japanese and Gurkha troops. The 20th Division must remain in place until sufficient troops are arrived, and the French start arriving in October 1945, and General Leclerc arrives with a colonial division of Senegalese troops. The Japanese hold the French in complete and utter contempt, and bruised Gallic pride really doesn't help matters at all. Gracie is forced to write to Mountbatten in November 1945, and he says, "It is most necessary that I should continue to run the whole Japanese side of things. The Japanese will take anything from us, but will do nothing for the French." French indiscipline grows and grows, and the attitude to Indian and Gurkha troops, as well as the Vietnamese, is really very, very poor. If you read John Cross's excellent book, First In, First Out, he talks about being a subaltern in the 1st Battalion, 1st Gurkha Rifles, and being in French Indo-China. And he recounts how a French officer hears him speaking to some of his riflemen in Gurkhali. And the French officer questions this. He said, what language are you speaking in? And Cross replies, Gurkhali. In the Indian Army, we speak the language of our men, and that's the language that we work in. Why don't you? At which the French officer looks at him with complete and utter horror and says to him, "If they do not speak French, they starve." Gracie is forced to write to Leclerc about the attitude of French troops to Indian and Gurkhas. And he writes the following: "Our men of whatever colour are our friends. They expect and deserve to be treated in every way as first-class soldiers. And this treatment should be and is exactly the same as white troops." Now, we probably wouldn't phrase such a letter in such terms, but you'll certainly understand the sentiment and also the strength behind the words that Gracie has written. The 20th Division stay in French Indochina until January 1946. The last troops to leave are the 19th Hyderabad, and as they leave, the route is lined part of the way by the remaining Japanese troops who cheer them. However, the die is cast for the future of Vietnam. The Dutch are probably in a worse state than the French in terms of reoccupying their Far Eastern territories. And certainly for the Dutch, Indonesian oil, and we're all familiar with Shell, is particularly important to Holland's post-war recovery. Consequently, the 23rd Indian Division and the 5th Indian Division are deployed on a 13-month campaign to the Dutch East Indies. The independence movement is led by Dr. Sukarno, who initially is very enthusiastic about the Japanese invasion. He believes that this is their opportunity to gain independence. And quite uncharacteristic for the Japanese, the independence movement is allowed a small amount of input to the army of the government of occupation. However, the relationship sours very, very quickly. Indonesia is a devoutly Muslim country, and the idea of emperor worship and compulsory emperor worship is not surprisingly deeply offensive. In the immediate power vacuum of the Japanese surrender, Sukarno declares independence, or Madaka, and the Japanese, as a farewell present, arm him. The 23rd Indian Division finally arrive in Indonesia in October 1945 to a very eerie silence, and their priority is the release of the 78,000 Dutch prisoners of war. The very tenuous peace quickly breaks out, and peace negotiations, a ceasefire has to be negotiated in Surabaya. Brigadier Malaby, who commands the 49th Indian Brigade, following the ceasefire negotiations, heads across the city to speak to the local militia who are surrounding a detachment of the 5th Maharat, of a detachment of his own soldiers. As he drives across the city, his car is attacked. They try and fight their way out. It involves throwing grenades. However, it fails. Malaby and the occupants of the staff car are killed. The journey he takes shows huge personal courage, and Malaby has been in country for 5 days, and here you see he's burnt out staff car. In November 1945, both divisions will mount an attack into Surabaya involving armour, naval gunfire support and air cover, and this is considered to be the last battle of the British Indian Army. And large-scale violence continues until the last battalion to leave are the Seaforths, who leave in November 1946. And during the fighting, 600 troops are killed and 1,400 are wounded. In 1946, it's handed over into the Dutch, and independence comes in December 1945 after a very brutal and bloody counterinsurgency campaign. However, we still have to deal with the liberation of Siam with a large Japanese garrison there, the liberation of Hong Kong, and also providing an army of occupation for Japan. The title of the next picture sums up really quite nicely what I want to talk about. And you'll notice here, you'll see a demonstration, and I don't know whether you can see clearly how it says we want ships, not assurances. And I touched on it very briefly in one of the opening slides about a very browned off and dissatisfied the services are. And we see in the following month a series of mutinies, both by British and Indian troops. And this is motivated by really two things. One, this idea that they've done their bit. They joined to fight Hitler, not to fight the Japanese. The war in Europe is over, and their moral contract is concluded. There's also a belief that if they'd not mobilised quickly, all the best jobs would have gone. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. Unemployment spikes at the end of the war because there's no longer a need for 25-pounder shells and Bren gun carriers. So suddenly factories have an empty order book, they need to retool, and they need to find new markets. And as a result, people are laid off. However, this is little consolation if you find yourself in a flooded tent in the Far East. And the government wants to slow down the rate of demobilisation, and it does this for three reasons. First of all, there's the need to maintain a garrison of empire, an army of occupation in Germany, Austria, and also Japan. Secondly, they want to control unemployment. One of the lessons that is learned from the rate of demobilisation of the First World War is that there are too many soldiers or ex-servicemen chasing too few jobs. So mobilisation, they want to slow it down and trickle men back into the labour market, bearing in mind that many men will not want to go back to their pre-war jobs. They've been upskilled while they've been in the services, and they've seen the world. And also the jobs that are available aren't the jobs they want to do. There are currently 400,000 German prisoners of war in Britain clearing bomb sites and working on farms. And the third motivation of the government for slowing down demobilisation is the state of the housing market. Britain's housing stock is in a pretty poor state in 1939, and 6 years of bombing and lack of building materials simply has not made it any better. Also, you have a number of wives that during the war would have gone back to live with their parents or their in-laws, and now as the men are returning, want homes. And also you have men returning who want to get married, to marry the girl they left behind and set up their own home. So the demand for housing when the stock is very small is great, and price controls need to be introduced on rents because rental costs are soaring. Therefore, you want to again trickle men back into civilian street. This is little consolation, and in January 1946, 50,000 RAF will mutiny across 14 locations across India and Burma. The services call it a mutiny. In reality, much of it is a sit-down protest. However, this event is not alone. A TA battalion in Palestine mutiny. They were mobilised for summer camp in September 1946 and haven't been home. In October 1945, HMS Northway in Singapore will mutiny. In May 1946, a parachute battalion will mutiny in Malaya, and they've just returned from the Dutch East Indies. And ultimately, there are 243 court-martials where sentences are between 3 to 5 years of hard labour. Mutinies are not restricted solely to British troops. We have the Royal Indian Navy mutiny covering 3 days in February 1946, involving 78 ships, 20 shore establishments and 20,000 troops. and it is a much more violent mutiny than the sit-down protests that you see in RAF stations. Concurrently, 1,000 Royal Indian Air Force mutiny, a company of Madrasi pioneers mutiny, Gurkhas in Karachi refused to fire on mutineers, and there's strikes. For the Royal Indian Navy, sentences are much lighter, and 476 troops are discharged. But what are the other problems exist? What to do with Indian prisoners of war who join the 2,000 that join the Free Legion of the Waffen SS, and the circa 40,000 that join the Indian National Army. And there's very much mixed emotions about what should be done, which range from everything from quietly discharging people through to people being hanged. It realised that there needs to be a series of court-martials, and many of the initial court-martials simply unravel on technicalities. However, in November 1945, a Muslim, a Sikh and a Hindu Indian Army officer who held senior appointments in the Indian National Army are court-martialed. The British believe that by selecting somebody from each of the three major religions in India, it will show impartiality. The reality is, it actually draws the three religions together in protest. The exact opposite effects occur. And Captain Prem Sehgal, Captain Shah Nawaz Khan, and Lieutenant Gubkash Singh Dhillon are charged with waging war against the King Emperor and murder or abetment to murder. And the trials are held in the Red Fort in Delhi. On the first day, over 100,000 people protest in a park in northern Delhi, and throughout the court-martial, which finally concludes on the 31st of December, there is rioting and there are large-scale demonstrations. The three defendants are sentenced to deportation for life, which is commuted to being cashiered, and they're immediately released to public adulation. There will ultimately be only 14 court-martials, and the last one occurs in 1946. But we're now on a path of increasing violence, which starts with Gandhi's Quit India campaign in the summer of 1942. Although the Quit India campaign really concludes in 1944, we've got this groundswell of more and more violence building up. On the 16th of August 1946, Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, will call for a direct day of action. A general strike occurs, and initially peaceful hartals, the closing of shops. However, communal violence in Calcutta is high, in part from the influx of refugees in 1942 and the Bengal famine, and violence explodes out, and you have a week of rioting where it's estimated that between 4,000 and 10,000 people are killed. The photograph you'll see here is a Hindu temple being attacked in Circular Road, but all religious sites and all communities are subject to the violence. On one night alone, the three British battalions in Calcutta are ordered to pick up 450 mutilated bodies from the streets. And here we see just a picture of progressive violence getting worse and worse in a country that is frankly swimming in weapons that have been left over from the war. And so we have this downward trail to the complete breakdown of society, the economy, in the rundown to partition. And the Indian Army remains impartial through the most difficult of times. However, British thinking is very much dominated by the experience of the mutiny. In the Viceroy's briefcase, there is always a file marked WCP, worst case possible. And this is the plan for what is to happen should there be a breakdown of law and order across India. Following the end of the war, it's rescribed. It's called Operation Monsoon, which includes Operation Madhouse, where the Indian Army becomes unreliable, Operation Bedlam, where the Indian Army mutinies, and Operation Ebb Tide, known as the Breakdown Plan, which is the fighting withdrawal back to Bombay to load up in ships, probably scenes which would have been the scenes of the retreat from Kabul in 1942 would have certainly motivated people. In March 1946, there is the victory parade in Delhi, but certainly the scenes that occur in New Delhi are nothing like the scenes we see of the victory parade in London. As the parade goes round Connaught Circus, stones and bricks are thrown at the soldiers, and the day ends with ball rioting and ball being fired. There's really very little to celebrate. Every year on the 15th of August, the following obituary will appear in the in memoriam section of the Daily Telegraph, and I'll give you just a few moments to read it. Stalin is credited to have said that a million casualties are a statistic, while one death is a tragedy. And we've talked about the large political events, and we conclude we're talking about Sub-Lieutenant Hockley, which just shines a tiny light onto the savage wars of peace and the chaos that broke out over the rapid surrender of the Japanese, and shockwaves that continued to reverberate across Southeast Asia and Southern Asia to today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Mike. I mean, it's quite extraordinary how chaotic and almost unmanageable the end of the war was in the Far East, uh, in a far greater way than it was in Europe as a consequence of the point you made. We were in partnership, frankly, with imperial allies who had their own agenda quite rightly, and who saw the Atlantic Declaration of August 1941 as something that was the capstone of their own ambitions for independence. And we saw a huge number of missteps, didn't we, by the colonial authorities. We've had one question about the question about whether the fighting today between Thailand and Cambodia is a consequence of this. I don't think so. I think it's certainly unrelated. Although, if the question were asked about the civil war in Myanmar, the answer would actually be yes, because the civil war that began, frankly, with the arrival of the Japanese is continuing today. And I was interested to see in the news today that where the 19th Indian Division crossed the Irrawaddy at the Beacon in middle of January 1945, the junta's forces have retaken locations that have been in rebel hands for a while. When did the fighting in Borneo end? Well, largely the same time. Phil Craig, actually, and I do recommend Phil's book, deals with the fighting in Borneo. It was almost like a mad Wild West with renegade Allied officers running around operating their own campaign. There's a question. I'll let you ask this, answer this, Mike. This is from Steve Squirrel. Do you think Churchill would have won had more servicemen been able to vote? It's a very interesting one because I remember being taught a long time ago that the military vote turned it for Attlee against Churchill. And it's
an urban myth, but the whole 1945 election is frankly pretty Heath Robinson-ish. Everybody is caught out by it, and the service vote in particular. I mentioned that only 12% of servicemen are able to vote, and one of the reasons, and it amazed me when I saw it in 1945, each candidate's political party isn't shown on the ballot paper. So unless somebody can send you election material from home, bearing in mind how long it takes for a letter to get to the Far East, you have no idea from the names on the ballot paper whether you're voting for a communist or a conservative. So a lot of men just don't vote rather than vote for the wrong party. And the whole idea, you think of the number of servicemen, the number of constituencies across the world, it's just chaotic trying to organise the service vote. Of interest, in 1950, the Labour Party gets 2 million more votes than it gets in 1945. Now, you could conflate that and say that's the servicemen that return and can finally vote. But the idea that the service vote gets rid of Churchill it's certainly not the case simply, and not enough of them were able to vote.
It's a fascinating point, and I wasn't aware that it was as low as 12%. When I was writing A War of Empires, I came across quite a lot of material produced by the Royal Army Educational Corps that was blatantly one-sided
I did, yeah.
in its depiction of the material, suggesting that the only way that Britain would and the empire would have a thoroughly democratic future was by voting Labour. But that's an aside.
Yeah.
George Wilton's made a very interesting point. He says, I worked in Indonesia in 1986-87 and spent some time in Surabaya. The battle against the British was still celebrated there as part of the Merdeka struggle. Now, Surabaya was very savagely bombed in 1945 by the Royal Air Force. I mean, it's bombed as savagely as any Japanese city, and it's something that, of course, we've all entirely forgotten in the United Kingdom. And it's not surprising that it's remembered in Indonesia. And again, Phil Craig talks about the bombing of Surabaya in his new book. There's a question here from Andrew McAvee. Is the reality not much could have been done by the British after the war due to all the circumstances, lack of troops, pounds, and will do much abroad, home front first? Well, I'll make a little observation on that. Yes, absolutely. The reality is that a lot of what happened from August 1945 was done in an absence of strategic thinking. And I think it's very easy to be critical of the military decision makers who are trying to fill a great political gap before the administrations, the political administrations in Indo-China and Indonesia were replaced. Now, the political structures in Singapore were replaced immediately because the British were there. That wasn't a problem. But in Indochina and Indonesia, it's a very, very different set of circumstances. So what do? You use the troops that you've got at hand. And one of the most remarkable things, as Mike has reminded us, is that Japanese prisoners of war were remarkably compliant and were very good. And I loved the quotation that Mike provided of when the 20th Indian Division left Indo-China, they were cheered by their Japanese comrades. I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? The whole thing is completely bizarre. I wondered whether you wanted to add anything more to that, Mike.
Or if you look on the Gurkha Museum, they interviewed John Cross a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
and he talks about his time in French Indochina, and it is fascinating to watch. But it just shows how we sup with the devil with the Chinese communists in Malaya, and we find ourselves a few months later supping with the devil with our former enemies, because they are better allies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's a very, very good way of putting it. Michael van der Goot has asked, when were the POWs and Changi repatriated? Well, so in the repatriation program, POWs were given first priority, but that didn't mean they were able to get home quickly. The biggest challenge in the Far East was shipping. The Germans had sunk 3,500 of the original 16,000 odd ships in the British Merchant Marine during the Second World War. And this was now a global war, of course, and the shipping simply didn't exist. So if you were a regular British soldier and you had served less than 5 years in the Far East, you were very lucky to get home in 1946. Most British troops didn't get home until 1947. Changi prisoners were repatriated first, and they got home in 1946.
Of course, a lot of them some of them were too sick to travel.
Yes, I mean, there's a very, very a little bit of work I've been doing recently on the prisoner of war experience, and there was a wide variety of prisoner of war experience from what I describe as the horrific, so the Burma Thai Railway, to the benign. The benign was still bad. Benign was starvation, hunger rather than deliberate starvation. And I put Changi prisoners, about 10,000, into that category. But you're absolutely right. It took a long time to get them into a fit state to be able to come home. And of course, Changi prisoners included Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Americans, Indians, and Brits. There's a question from Tony Vickers. The answer, Tony, is yes. Does the Imperial War Museum hold much about this period? Look, Tony, there's lots and lots of sources for data. So everyone else can see this. My father had a Japanese general surrender to him. We don't know where or when. He was acting commander 33 Indian Brigade at the time, and all we know is that he greatly admired the discipline of the disarmed Japanese troops. Well, I can just say that he wasn't alone. Even soldiers who hated the Japanese, who were involved in the hard fight against the Japanese, and if anyone's in any doubt, all you need to do is read George McDonald's Fraser to get a sense of that hatred. They still admired the Japanese, and they admired the way they surrendered. Um, Look, there's a lot of stuff in the Imperial War Museum. There's even more in the Little Hart Archives at King's College, um, London, where I suspect you would find material about the Indian Infantry Brigade and indeed and the British Library. But if you want to find out anything else, just and there's quite a lot actually. You will find the archives in the National Archives Museum, National Archives as well in Kew. But send me an email. There's a question here for you, Mike. Can you remember how long did the 5th Indian Division remain in Indonesia?
Well, the campaign was 13 months, with the Sea Force being the last to leave.
So they would have left in 1947.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? There is actually a very good book on the early years, and particularly on Douglas Gracie's 20th Indian Division uh, um, in Indo-China, called The First Vietnam War. And it was written by a chap called, I think it was called Peter Dunn in the 1960s or 70s, and it's very well worth reading. Peter O'Brien has asked, given that the leaders should have foreseen the war would come to an end, but well, it's just not true, Peter, I'm afraid. It appears as there's no planning for the surrender and aftermath. There was a huge amount of planning, actually, for the war continuing deep into 1947. And I've done a little bit of work on Operation Downfall in the last few months. Operation Downfall, of course, was the plan to invade Japan. The first phase, a largely American plan. Britain and the Commonwealth were eventually going to contribute a core. The first part of that was the invasion of Kyushu in December 1945, followed by the invasion of effectively the Tokyo Plain in March 1946. That war was expected to continue for another 12 months, so to 1947. That's the challenge. There was no expectation that the war would finish, even in early August 1945. Remember, very few people knew about the Manhattan Project. And very few people, even those who knew about the Manhattan Project, knew that I had any expectation that it would be as effective as it was. Look, and yes, a very good question from Sayantini Gupta. Any interesting memoirs about the INA men picked up in Southeast Asia 1945, 46? Yeah, there's lots of it. Michael Ward Fay wrote a very good book on the INA, and there are two very good books on the INA coming up, both by friends of the Kohima Educational Trust. One is Gautam Hazarika. His book on the INA and other Indian prisoners of war is coming out in September or October. I am writing the introduction. It's a superb book. Chanda Sundaram has also written, or is in the process of writing, a book on the INA. Chanda has given a presentation for the KET in the past. And I think for the first time, actually, we're getting a really good view of a really good objective historical view of the importance or otherwise and the politicization of the INA. Malaysia versus Indonesia, Malayan emergency. Yeah, very fascinating question from Vijay Shrao. There is no doubt, and Mike's made this point very clear, that the Malayan People's Liberation Army came out of the anti-Japanese the Malayan Anti-Japanese People's Army, which became the Malayan Anti-British People's Army, which became the Malayan Racist Liberation Army, which led directly into the insurgency in Malaya, which of course ran from 1940, 48, 49 through to 1960, effectively finished in 47, but in 57, but it was declared over in 1960. The Indonesian confrontation was a very different war. Between the new Malaysia and the new Indonesia in the 1960s. And that came about as a result of the construction of these new countries that emerged out of the Second World War. Well, we've run out of time. If there are any other questions that people want to raise, then please just send us an email and we'll try and yes, that Dunn, that's Peter Dunn. Someone's listed that on the chat if you want to read about the First Vietnam War. It's very good. Yes, Finley Kemper's reminded us that Court and Save Out Heroes and BBC Sounds this week. It's been absolutely amazing. Oh, I didn't realize that Dunn's book is available for free, but it's absolutely first class. I think that's probably enough for me. It's time now to hand back to Sylvia.
Mm.
Well, what a brilliant response to a fabulous, fabulous presentation, Mike. I mean, you covered so much, and there is so much to cover, and your level of detail, getting all that out in 50 minutes, amazing. Thank you so much. And a lot of food for thought, particularly from those of us who are not as familiar with what happened in the aftermath as we might be with what happened during the war itself.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for that. And you can tell we've had lots of questions tonight. And as Rob has said, if there are other questions that have remained unanswered or still to come, we will pick them up as quickly as I am able to pass them on. Thank you. Well, just to let you know that we launched our Book of Remembrance at York at the end of last month and have been delighted with everyone's reactions. It is a wonderful collection of moving stories and memories generously contributed by so many of you. And we've started with the launch with 78 entries, but happily we are still receiving more contributions, which we will collate and add to the book in time to release an updated edition, hopefully in the start of the new year. If you have yet to send us your family stories and would like to do so, we would be grateful to receive them by the end of September. Meanwhile, have a look at it on our website. It is truly inspirational. And the RBL have produced a stunning VJ80 poppy pin, which is in shiny silver. I'm afraid we've sold most of ours. I've got 2 left. If you want them, can you email me? And then the first email, you can order it and I'll send them to you. But I hope RBL have still got some available. So do go on to their website at the Poppy Shop. And hopefully you can get one in time for VJ Day from them. Speaking of VJ80, there are lots and lots of events taking place over the week and weekends surrounding the 15th of August. There's an evensong service at Leicester Cathedral on the Thursday. And then, of course, on the 15th, the Royal British Legion have their event at the National Memorial Arboretum. I believe official tickets are no longer available, but you can attend. There's parking places, and I'm going to have to cough. Sorry. This happened to me the other day. Rob, can you just read through this?
Yes. So in addition to the Arboretum, there's the National FIPO Fellowship invitation to their commemorations at Norwich Cathedral at 11 on Friday the 15th. If you are around this part of the world where I am, between the Chilterns in London, then the Gurkha Welfare Trust are holding a very special lunch and a talk by me on VJ Day. In Sidmouth, a commemoration is going to be held at the War Memorial. I don't have any details of the times for that. You'll find them online. The families and friends of the Far East Prisoners of War have organised a service at Lichfield. That's a double up at 2 p.m. on the 16th, Saturday the 16th. And at Westminster Abbey, this will be on filmed on the BBC, I think. There's a service of reconciliation at Westminster Abbey as part of the evensong service at 3 p.m. And the Japanese ambassador who came up to see us in York will also be in attendance. And there's on the Sunday, wreaths will be laid during a service at Beast Fair, followed by a service at Snaith Prior at 10:30. If you're up in the Selby Goole district. And then just a little bit further on in September, a little bit of a prompt for everyone. On Saturday, the 20th of September, it's going to be a very big launch by the National Army Museum of their Beyond Burma Forgotten Armies presentation, which will run for, I think, 6 months. On that particular day, there's going to be lots of talks. I'll be there. A number of other people are going to be there. Lucy Betteridge Dyson's going to be there talking about her fabulous new book, Jungle Commandos. and I think I'm last on the Sunday, but that's going to be something you need to put in your diary, Saturday, the 20th of September.
Thank you, Rob, for rescuing me again. And there's one more event in Wales, the town of, apologies for my accent, Llaniphilyn, where they're arranging an exhibition in the town's meeting room to mark VJ Day. This will also be on the 15th of August. So there are lots and lots of things going on, and I hope that we will see you at one or more of them. Our next webinar will be on September 25th, entitled Thunder Run, Mike Tickner, when our host will be the historian Jack Bowsher, and promises to be another interesting and entertaining evening. So until then, hope to see you in the next few weeks. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night, everyone.